How many of us can remember going through difficult experiences which at the time we actually hated and found really challenging, but then looking back, we realised that God had his hand on it, that somehow God was working through it. And looking back, things worked out well. Well, if we can remember such an incident, maybe also we ask the question, why? Why did we have to go through this in the first place? You know, it's like going through this difficulty and then looking back and think, oh, yes, I can see God is in it now, but why were things set up that way, that we had to go through it? Why didn't God use another way of achieving what he wanted to achieve without putting us through all that hardship? Well, I hope as we look at our passage this morning from Genesis chapter 45, verses 1 to 15, that we will see something of an answer to that question. Last week, those of us who were here will remember we looked at how Joseph in Genesis chapter 37 was betrayed by his brothers and sold by them as a slave into Egypt. They sold him to traders. They took him down to Egypt where he was sold as a slave. And yet, through many hardships and a succession of miracles, God raised him to the place of greatest honour, second only to Pharaoh, in charge of that whole land of Egypt. And if you remember, those of us who were here last week, our focus then was how his brothers would feel, those brothers who betrayed him, how they would feel on that day when eventually they met Joseph again. Well, in our passage today that Joseph has read to us, well, that moment has come. Joseph's brothers have been living back with their father. Famine has come, and eventually if their father said, look, we're going to starve here, I'm going to send you, I've heard that down in Egypt there's a man who is selling food, who's selling grain, you can go down to him. So Joseph's brothers went down to Egypt to buy food, having told their father that Joseph was dead, having sold him to slave traders all those years before, assuming they would never see him again. They went down, they appeared before Joseph, and though they didn't recognize him, he recognized them. And in a way, not surprisingly, Joseph tests them. He wants to know what these brothers who treated him in that way, who were so awful to him, what are they like now? So he tests them. He basically says to them, look, you are spies. You've come into Egypt to spy the place out. And they say, no, we're not spies at all. We've not come with evil intent. We're honest people. We've just come to buy food. And he says to them, prove it. He said, well, he said, no. They said, we are just 10 of 12 brothers. The youngest one is dead, they tell him. Well, he knew that was a lie. That was him. They'd sold him as a slave. So he knew that was a lie. And they said, and we've got another young brother. His name's Benjamin. He's with our father because our father didn't want to let him come down with us because he's already lost one young child. He doesn't want to lose another one. So that's the case. And Joseph just turned around and said, well, you prove it then. And what he said to them is, I'm going to keep one of you brothers here. And he kept Simeon. He said, look, you're not in prison. You can go back, the remaining 9 of you, to your father, but don't ever come down here again unless you bring Benjamin with you. And if you bring your brother Benjamin with you, then I'll know that what you're telling me is the truth. Well, the brothers went back to their father, and just to sort of make life even more difficult for them, Joseph gave them all the food that they'd come to buy, and then told his servants, and put their money back in their sacks. So when they got back to their father, not only they got the food, but they'd also got the money that was taken down to pay for them, which would have made life even more difficult if they ever went back again, i.e., how come you went off with the food and didn't pay for it? The famine continued. The food ran out. Faced with starvation, the family faced a difficult situation. They had no choice than to go back to Egypt. But they knew the person they thought was this hostile man, how he treated them, and there's a nasty, difficult conversation in the family. The father, Jacob, did not want Benjamin to go with them, but unless they took Benjamin, there's no way they'd been told that they'd ever see Joseph again. So they had to take him, and also that was the only way they're going to get Simeon out of jail. Jacob is apprehensive. Judah. Now, Judah is the brother, those of us here last week, who suggested, let's sell Joseph to those slave traders. Yep, we'll take 20 pieces of silver. Judah was the one who sold Joseph into slavery in the first place. And he personally turns to his father and says, I will guarantee the safety of Benjamin. I will not let anything happen to him. Well, they go down with Benjamin into Egypt. And the story continues. They appear before Joseph. Benjamin is there. They buy food. And Joseph then says to his servants, and when you pack it up, take my personal cup and hide it in the sack of the younger brother. And then the brothers head back with their food to their father, and Joseph sends his servants after them and stops them and accuses them of stealing. And the question is, how come when the master of Egypt has treated you so well, you steal from him? And they all as one say, no, we're honest people. We wouldn't do that. They're accused of the crime, and they agree between them, if any of the brothers have got his cup in their sack, let that person be sold as a slave. And of course, lo and behold, there it is in the sack of Benjamin. At that point, Judah steps forward and he says, no, don't take Benjamin to be sold as a slave. He says, take me instead. Joseph was testing his brothers. Quite clearly, these men who've come back have changed. Why have they changed? Was it years of guilty conscience? Was it the years of seeing their father broken-hearted, thinking that his youngest son was dead? We don't know, but quite clearly these men had changed. And it was at that point that Joseph makes himself known to his brothers. And in verses 4 and 5, he says this, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. But don't be upset, and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. Quite clearly, here at the end of the story, Joseph had a peace. He had a peace about all that had happened. Do you know what? I bet he didn't have a peace about it at the time. I bet he had no peace at all. As he was dragged away in chains, turning back, looking at his brothers who'd just sold him, as he was dragged away from them and across the desert towards Egypt, it wouldn't have felt like God was in it then. When he stood chained up in front of a slave market and people were bidding on him, and finally the hammer fell, sold to that person over there, I bet it didn't feel like God was in it then. And then when he was working in a household as a slave and he was earning the respect of the family he was working in, he was falsely accused by the wife of the slave owner of appalling things, and he was put in prison without so much as a trial. I bet it didn't feel like God was in it then. For years, he must have lain awake in bed asking why. Why has God allowed this to happen? Some of us might have been through difficult times in our lives and just asked those questions. Why has God allowed this to happen to me? Well, in Matthew chapter 10, verses 29 to 31, Jesus reassures his disciples of God's care for them. He basically says to them, look, sparrows are 10 a penny, but God knows everything that happens to a sparrow. And he says, and you my disciples, those he was talking to, us today, you are worth more, so much more than a sparrow. Many of us will have been through difficult times. As we go through those difficult times, that truth, that promise of God is the one we have to hold on to. God really cares for us. God is in control. But you know what? That doesn't answer the question we started with. It still leaves the question, why couldn't God, who created all things, who is in control of all things, why couldn't God just engineer things differently so there's the same good outcome without us going through all the hardship and all the suffering? I mean, why in the story from Genesis didn't God just put a more kindly heart in Pharaoh so that Pharaoh just said in a famine, oh, look, the lands round about, they're all starving. Let's just make sure we provide food for them. Why didn't God handle things differently? Well, the answer to that is that God is constantly working, and God's goodness is constantly at work to correct wrong that exists, that is there. We live in a fallen world. We live in an evil world where wrong simply exists. And where wrong actions, because of that, wrong actions are taking place all the time. People are constantly doing things that are not right. And therefore, the goodness of God is not working on a blank canvas. God is working, bringing good from the bad situation that already exists. Egypt in the Old Testament is consistently presented as a place to be avoided. It's a place to be avoided. If we look at the book of Genesis, Joseph's grandfather, Isaac, gravitated his way, made his way down into Egypt. Read the story. The outcome was not good. Joseph's great-grandfather, Abraham, made his way down into Egypt. Again, look at the story. The outcome was not good. And if we look forward in the Bible, beyond the book of Genesis, into the next chapter, Exodus, well, Exodus is all about how, having gone down into Egypt, Jacob, at the time of Joseph, had gone down into Egypt. They lived there, they settled there, 400 years pass, and by then, the people of Israel are slaves. Slaves in Egypt. The outcome isn't good. Egypt is not a good place to be. And when we look at this story, we need to recognize that Joseph is only there because of the bad actions of his brothers. Joseph is only in Egypt because his brothers did what was wrong. They hated him, they wanted to kill him, and they sold him as a slave instead. What we must hold on to, And I think the key point of this story to always remember is God is constantly making good out of what is not good. God is constantly taking things from where they are, which is not where he would have wanted them to be. God would probably never have wanted his people to be in Egypt in the first place, but there they were. He probably wouldn't have wanted Egypt to be like that, but it was. God is not starting from a blank canvas. He's constantly making good from where we are, which is not good. In those agonizing years, and all those occasions when he must have lain awake at night, Joseph must have come to realize that. Yeah, he shouldn't have been where he was. The circumstances he was in were not good, but God was constantly making good out of what was not good. That's a lesson the Apostle Paul learned when he wrote to the church at Colossae in Colossians 1 verse 24. He says this, "I'm glad when I suffer for you in my body, for I am participating in the suffering of Christ that continues for his body, the church." You know, the Apostle Paul too learned that actually the world is bad, but Christ has come to do something about it. Christ died so we could be forgiven. Christ rose again so we could have life for him. Christ rose so we can have a different life. We can be changed. And the church is going on making good from what is not good. And what we have to remember as Christian believers is often the things we are suffering is what Jesus was talking about when he said taking up our cross. Suffering for him, bearing the hardship that will one day all be turned into good, because God has not started with a blank canvas. He started from where we are. In those occasions when we ask why, the answer is that God always and is constantly starting in a hopeless situation and making good.